2021 series. Today's lecture is partnered with the Tenderloin Museum and explores true neighborhood preservation in San Francisco's Tenderloin district with Kathy Luper and Randy Shaw. We'd like to extend a special thank you to the Northeastern Pennsylvania chapter of the American Institute of Architects and Marywood University School of Architecture for sponsoring this year's lecture series. Launched by a group of activists, practitioners, and academics in 2005, the Center for the Living City holds the singular distinction of being the only urbanist organization founded in collaboration with Jane Jacobs. In the years since its founding, the center has become a leading global urbanist organization, advancing social, environmental, and economic justice forums are at the core of our purpose. We work to invite all perspectives, particularly those of the marginalized, to participate in the creation of solutions which are empathetic, responsive, and community-based. Our vision is one where cities are vibrant, adaptive, equitable, communities designed for everybody, by everyone. And I am Maria McDonald, and I have the honor to be the executive director of the Center for the Living City. I'm coming to you from Scranton, Pennsylvania, hometown of Jane Jacobs. And with me behind the Zoom is Chelsea Gauthier, the associate director of the Center for the Living City, and she's coming to us from Salt Lake City, Utah. We have a really great lecture scheduled for today. We've been eagerly looking forward to this one. And we want to again thank the Northeastern Pennsylvania chapter of the American Institutes of Architects. And we look forward to many more collaborations together. If you are joining us today from the AIA for CEU credit, please just enter your name and your AIA number in the chat at the bottom of the screen as we roll through, and it will be recorded. And I also want to give a special hello to the Marywood architecture students who are joining us from cars and buses and trains and desks and on field visits all over today. And welcome to all of you who are joining us from around the country and the world. Before we introduce our two esteemed speakers, we are pleased to have the Tenderloin Museum's Executive Director, Katie Conry, and the Program Director, Alex Spotto, are here with us. Thank you to Alex for spearheading and taking the lead on organizing this lecture today. Katie is now going to give us an introduction on the Tenderloin Museum. Hi, Katie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. And thank you to the Center for the Living City for collaborating with us on this event. The Tenderloin Museum opened in 2015 and celebrates the rich history of San Francisco's most overlooked neighborhood. And we highlight the pioneering activism and fierce resistance that's woven deeply into the story of the Tenderloin through history exhibitions, resident-led walking tours, community programs, and the presentation of original artwork. And we aim to make visible the stories of Tenderloin residents and their predecessors. And we invite all to learn about the roots of our dynamic neighborhood and to reclaim our city's past and future. The Tenderloin Museum's weekly community-driven public programming illuminates the Tenderloin's history and involves its vibrant community in exploring and interpreting its roots. And our programming is at the intersection of art, history, and community and amplifies the untold stories of a long marginalized neighborhood. Many of our events are still being held virtually. So for those of you outside of the Bay Area, we welcome you to subscribe to our newsletter and or YouTube channel to check out our future and past virtual public programming. The Tenderloin Museum is located on the ground floor of the historic Cadillac Hotel SRO nonprofit housing founded by Kathy and Leroy Luper. And Kathy Luper and Randy Shaw were both instrumental in the creation of the Tenderloin Museum. Randy is our founder and serves on the board of directors, and Kathy is our board president and landlady. So thanks again to the Center for the Living City and to Kathy and Randy for sharing their history and insights with us today. And I'll pass it back to you, Maria, to introduce them both and get the conversation started.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie. Okay, so now it is my honor, really, truly an honor, to introduce both Kathy and Randy. Kathy Luper is the executive director of Reality House West, a nonprofit that operates the historic Cadillac Hotel and provides drug rehabilitation services, housing for low-income seniors and youth offenders, plus community and economic development work in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. She is also the co-founder and owner of the Chateau Agape, a nationally recognized residential care home for 27 severely mentally ill low-income adults, and is the president of the Tenderloin Museum's board of directors. Kathy, we are so grateful to have you here with us today, and thank you for all of the amazing work that you do from all of us. Truly, thank you.
Thank you.
We also have Randy Shaw, who is the director of San Francisco's Tenderloin's Housing Clinic, editor of Beyond Cron, and founder of the Tenderloin Museum. He has worked in the Tenderloin for over 40 years and participated in many neighborhood struggles. Shaw has also led the effort to create the National Uptown Tenderloin Historic District, which includes 409 historic buildings. Shaw is the author of the Tenderloin, Sex, Crime, and Resistance in the Heart of San Francisco, as well as other books on neighborhood activism and grassroots empowerment. Randy, thank you for being here. Also, I would love to have everyone check out Beyond Cron, as I had just started to do this morning, and is a wonderful place to explore all the amazing work that you've been pursuing for the last so many years, and I just can't wait to dive into that. And there's also a connection between the center and Beyond Cron now, as you put a great post up this morning. So thank you for being here, and thank you for this conversation to both of you, Randy and Kathy. So as we go now, we'll, it's going to be a conversation. It's going to go about 30 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes of talking. And for our guests, please use the question and answer feature at the bottom of the Zoom. You can also upvote your questions that you'd like to see addressed as well. And we will facilitate questions and answers at the end. Katie and I will jump back on and we'll start taking questions and answers. And then this lecture will be posted to YouTube later this evening. And you can also link to it from the center's main site and our YouTube channel. So that's my introduction. Enough of that. And I'm so happy to hear this wonderful panel start having their talk. Away you go.
Well, why don't we start by Kathy laying out her entrance to the Tenderloin and how we ended up fighting for neighborhood preservation. So Kathy, why don't you get us going?
Okay, so Leroy and I, just by freak accident, stumbled across a hotel for sale in 1976, and the owner helped us purchase it, along with funding from different various banks and whatever. And we thought it was a great opportunity to preserve this hotel for low-income housing. That's how it had been used for years and years. And shortly after we moved in and got everything straightened out and rehabbed some of the rooms, we found out that City Hall had different plans for our community. They wanted to put 3 new hotels at a convention site, and they were going to raise down, I don't know how many blocks, but blocks in the Tenderloin, which meant that we would have lost all this great housing, and it would have totally changed the dynamics of our neighborhood. So we joined an organization called the North of Market Planning Coalition. And they were an organizing organization that was working towards preserving the Tenderloin community. And that's how I personally met Randy and all the other activists in our neighborhood. And we were all united in wanting to fight this from happening. One of the ways I thought was a good way to do it would be to have it designated as a historic district. It didn't happen when I wanted it to happen, but it happened later, and it was important that it did happen. And Randy was the spearhead of that movement. Randy, you might want to talk about your association with the North of Market Planning Coalition.
Yeah, well, here's some interesting. I got involved in the Tenderloin because I was in law school in nearby Hastings Law School, and I got involved in early 1980. We opened up the Tenderloin Housing Clinic in February 1980, and I was really getting connected to the neighborhood. And then I go to a meeting, I'll never forget this, in like June, and Richard Livingston, who was then working for the Cadillac Hotel, tells us about these 3 luxury hotels. And I'm thinking, I just got connected to this neighborhood and now they want to demolish it. And, in my book on the Tenderloin, as well as in the Activist Handbook, I do detail the whole fight just around the luxury hotels and what it all meant and the like. But I think what's important, since we have a lot of Jane Jacobs people here, to notice the distinctions between what happened in the Tenderloin and the West Village, because the iconic struggle against Robert Moses that Jane Jacobs and her colleagues waged in the Tenderloin, our first effort, the first campaign theme was the Tenderloin is a neighborhood.
Mhm.
Because as I describe in my book, the Tenderloin was a great neighborhood forever, but then by the late 50s, early 60s, but it was downhill. By the 1980, it was very downhill. So whereas the West Village was a widely considered a very successful neighborhood about to be freewayed, people didn't care about the Tenderloin because it wasn't even seen as a neighborhood. So we had to first establish that we are a neighborhood before we can have a neighborhood preservation campaign. So when people wonder, like, wait, why are all those flyers and posters and signs saying the Tenderloin is a neighborhood? It's because City Hall didn't see it that way.
Right, we had how many, let's see, about 3,000 children living in a 10-block radius. We didn't even have school. They were
Yeah.
bused all over the city. And there was a campaign to start a school, which eventually we took to the ballot and we got the money to do that. But it was a struggle to get people to see that we were a community of people, families, single people, people who worked in the shops, people who supported the industries of San Francisco, all lived in the Tenderloin. And it wasn't just a slum, it was a neighborhood. And that was a real struggle to get people to acknowledge that.
And the context, San Francisco had just gotten through demolishing thousands of SRO hotel units and displacing thousands of people from the south of Market as part of redevelopment. They originally tried to do redevelopment in the Tenderloin, and I described in my book how that didn't happen. But nevertheless, it wasn't like some radical idea that we're just going to demolish the Tenderloin. That was like a plan. So we saw these 3 luxury hotels that were planned, the Hilton, the Ramada, and the Holiday Inn at the time, those 3 national chains, building 30-story hotels as a real, like the first step, not just that they would end with those 3, but that they would take over the entire area and extend Union Square, which borders the Tenderloin. If you know San Francisco, it's south of Union Square. It's southwest of Union Square. That would just expand Union Square to take over the entire Tenderloin with luxury hotels. So that was why we had to wage this big fight. And again, not only were we not considered a neighborhood, but nothing was being demolished originally. Whereas Jane Jacobs and her team could just point to all the shops and the housing and the people who were going to be demolished and lose their homes by a freeway. They weren't actually demolishing really any buildings. They're building on parking lots and vacant areas. But we were concerned that these 3 30-story buildings right on the border of a low-income neighborhood would create what we described as a touristification effect in the Tenderloin. Our fear was always that Union Square was booming, tourism in San Francisco was booming, they want more land for it, and this is just the beginning. It wasn't the 3 hotels per se alone, but that where it would lead to.
Well, they also wanted to build a convention center
Yeah.
right off of Mason Street, which was like in the heart of the Tenderloin. And that would have taken a whole block.
So, again, we didn't have a Robert Moses as the iconic villain, and we didn't have the freeway, and we didn't have the Robert Moses, two kind of iconic aspects of the West Village struggle. We also did not have a heavily well-educated population. We didn't have a Jane Jacobs kind of person, those kind of people who were, middle-class people living in the area. Our opposition group in the neighborhood were very low income, many on SSI, social disability, seniors. And when you looked at it from the start, you thought there would be no way that we could potentially not even have a fight. But we surprised them all. And one thing we did, and Leroy Looper was very involved in this in 1981, and this is like really important for activists to realize, instead of just thinking, okay, we're going to try to fight this battle and do the best we can, then we'll fight the next battle. In 1981, people like Sarah Cohn from the North Market Planning Coalition got community leaders to sign a rezoning petition. So we filed to rezone the neighborhood so they couldn't build any more luxury hotels after this fight. And that was why the big fight to save the Tenderloin was ultimately won in 1985 when we rezoned the entire neighborhood, and you couldn't build any more tourist hotels.
We were all astonished that Dean Makris, who is the head of planning for the city, agreed with us and supported this movement. We were astonished because it just went against everything we thought was going to happen. It was almost like celebrating that he had the foresight to recognize this as a community and a neighborhood, and then to agree that we needed to preserve it, that this housing that it represented needed preservation.
And Kathy makes a very good point about the context, because the context of Jane Jacobs' struggle, and by the way, I cannot recommend highly enough, if there's anyone on this event, watching this event, who haven't read Peter Lawrence's Becoming Jane Jacobs, it's not only the best book on Jane Jacobs, but one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. So be sure to, if you're interested in really knowing her history and what she was about and the planning aspect, this is really the book. But the context is very important. Robert Moses was busy demolishing all kinds of neighborhoods. He didn't just pick the West Village, and he succeeded in most low-income communities in New York City. The West Village was an exception. Similarly, in San Francisco, our mayor, Dianne Feinstein, was supporting high-rise development everywhere. So the idea that her planning director, who was considered the architect and the driving force helping to get all these projects through the Manhattanization of San Francisco, the idea that planning director would actually support the rezoning, the downzoning of the Tenderloin, it's quite remarkable. And it's a tribute to the campaign that the residents and their supporters waged. It's that they got a very pro-development mayor to say, you know what, we're going to protect the low-income quality of the Tenderloin.
Yes, that was pretty amazing. That was a major victory. I mean, we don't pat ourselves on the back enough, but that was a major victory, getting Dianne Feinstein, who was our mayor at the time, and Dean Makris, who was the planning director, to acknowledge the Tenderloin and to recognize that the need for housing, low-income housing, was important enough to do this and go against all the plans that had been made before, everything.
And you know, one of the ironic aspects of the whole hotel fight was all of us were convinced that if you let these 3 luxury hotels get built on the border of the neighborhood, they were on the border of the neighborhood, bordering toward the more tourist areas. If you let them get built, that the Tenderloin would be taken over by t-shirt shops. And we had an image in our heads of Fisherman's Wharf and how that was totally taken over by, mud and just kind of schlocky tourist stuff, and that it would drive up costs. Well, it turned out that we had no touristification of the Tenderloin from those 3 hotels. And we were later complaining that none of the guests in those tourist hotels ever even came to the Tenderloin. They're all afraid to come, or they were told not to come. So our neighborhood did not get any economic benefit at all from those tourist hotels, which is kind of a strange irony of what we thought was going to happen, and often when it's a freeway, there's nothing to debate. You know what you're getting. But tourist hotels are a complex beast when it comes to neighborhood preservation, how they impact neighborhoods.
I'd like to also mention that Randy was instrumental in getting the Tenderloin declared a historic neighborhood. And I think it's local, not national, but it's
national. It's national.
Is it national?
Yeah.
And that adds another layer of protection for the Tenderloin. It just, it doesn't stop development, but it adds another layer of protection. And it also gives landlords an incentive to fix up the exterior of their buildings if they follow certain guidelines. And I think that really helps a lot. It helps in many ways, but one of the ways it does help is it gives us a sense of neighborhood identity, a sense of pride, a sense of community, a sense of boundaries that sets us apart from other neighborhoods.
People in the Tenderloin people in the Tenderloin really, the residents love the history. We have like historic plaques in over 100 buildings identifying their history. And those of you who are in the architecture business, next time you come to San Francisco, make sure you go to contact the museum and get on one of their tours, because they give you tours. Offer tours of the Tenderloin. And I tell you, I can't tell you how many people I've given personal tours to the Tenderloin who say, I can't believe they have all these historic buildings. I never knew this about the Tenderloin, because actually there is no neighborhood in San Francisco that is more similar to the 1930s than the Tenderloin.
Yes.
We've had remarkably few changes since the 1930s. You look at New York City and you can't even recognize a lot of Manhattan right now. The Tenderloin has stayed pretty much intact. So with a very few exceptions, very little was built in the 50s and 60s when the zoning allowed big buildings. So it's really a truly historic neighborhood, and it's really been preserved in the best way of that term, because frequently now in our time, we hear about neighborhood preservation. It's often a way to keep low-income people out. The Tenderloin's neighborhood preservation designed to keep low-income people in. So it's really the perfect model for neighborhood preservation efforts.
Yeah, it really is. And I think for me, one of the nicest things is that because the neighborhood was so downtrodden and poor, and it was considered for a possible redevelopment site, no one wanted to spend money fixing up the buildings when they might be torn down. So when redevelopment didn't come into the Tenderloin, again, because of neighborhood activism, the buildings were intact. They stayed the same. The lobbies look the same. The storefronts pretty much look the same. The exterior of the buildings, with the exception of maybe some bad paint jobs, look the same. And it's interesting when you come through the Tenderloin on one of the tours that the museum gives, you'll see all this great symmetry of buildings. They're not chopped up. They're not modern buildings next to older buildings. They have the same architecture because they were pretty much built at the same time and preserved. So I just love it.
Well, it's very similar to the West Village, which I go to regularly. Well, I used to go to regularly before COVID when I went to New York City. The West Village is pretty much unchanged. There has not been a lot of development around that area. And the stores are dramatically different. It's far more gentrified and upscale, but physically, there's a lot of resemblances, I think. I do see we have a lot of potential questions, so maybe we should cut it here, Kathy, and start taking questions.
Okay, I don't know exactly how to go about doing this, so someone can read the questions out loud if you don't mind. Would it be under chats? Yeah.
Katie, why don't
Hello.
you?
Yeah, I'm here to read the questions.
Oh, good.
Well, forgive me if I'm potentially pronouncing this wrong, but someone had a question if there was a connection between Dean Makris, is that right?
Yes.
And Makris Realty, if any?
No, they're spelled differently. Makris Realty is M-A-K-R-A-S. Dean Makris was M-A-C-R-I-S, and he was planning director during the Feinstein years and stayed on during the Agnos years for a good period. So and then he came back he's been around a long time, and he was seen as, he was the person Feinstein put in to sort of get through her development projects and her downtown plan and everything. And so, I always say it's remarkable that we got him to support the Tenderloin rezoning, because that's not what he was normally up to.
Yeah, Sarah Colm actually commented that she thinks that he supported our efforts to get the 3 hotels to pay for mitigation measures.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, because we sort of omitted this critical fact, which is that the 3 hotels got built, but they had to it was the first time in the United States that a private developer, as a condition of approval, had to fund nonprofit affordable housing. They had to get 4 hotels, and there was a cash part of it. And the Chronicle, and I have this in my book on the Tenderloin, I have the charts where the picture of this, the Chronicle report, the columnists were outraged. They accused the Tenderloin of shaking down big corporations, of being extortionists. And just think, here we have all these folks, none of them got personal money, but we win mitigations in the form of nonprofit housing, and the Chronicle calls us extortionists, as if the Tenderloin residents had such power they could intimidate the Hilton, Holiday Inn, big corporate, and Ramada, those 3 big international corporations. So I guess that we had more power than we thought we had.
I always thought we had power. We had power in the numbers, and we had power in the sense that our power didn't rely on money. It just relied on dedication. And we had a lot of dedicated people who were quite afraid of losing their housing if this happened. So they were willing to fight to the end, and they did, and we got some wonderful things out of it. These mitigation funds funded a lot of good programs in the Tenderloin.
I mean, now it's rather common. We have community benefit agreements with every single development almost of that size. But in those days, this was 1980, that no one ever heard of that. They just would just do stuff, and so again, the context of a very pro-development mayor, but feeling the Tenderloin had issued such a show of strength that it had to do more than just approve the projects. And we have those 4 hotels under nonprofit control right now.
So we have another question. Appreciate so much your rendition of that critical period. As a resident and worker in the neighborhood, its character is so important, particularly the density of artists. Can you imagine a cultural center for us here, as other SF neighborhoods have? And could this help insulate from gentrification?
Well, there's always, whenever you talk about a cultural center or a gymnasium, which we've talked about for years, the question in Tenderloin always comes, there's not a lot of space. Like, we don't have a park, not a real park. We have Bodecker Park, but that would not be a park in most cities. It'd be a small thing. And we don't really, the Tenderloin was the nation's probably first apartment and hotel district. We have one single family home that was built in the 50s on a parking lot, but we don't have single family homes. We don't have flats. We have all apartments, hotels, which is really unique. It's you know, and it was always the common size of buildings was 8 stories. That's why we rezoned to keep it 8 stories. So we've always had a space issue in the Tenderloin. And unfortunately, the neighborhood was broken off in the 50s to build federal buildings on just to the west of the Tenderloin is the federal building, the state building. Those could have been big parks. Those could have been cultural centers, but they became public buildings. So that's the challenge of a cultural center, is where do you have the land for it?
Rather than look at land, I would look at the fact that when the Tenderloin was built, we didn't have garages. We had auto body shops. We had shops where you could park your car. As a matter of fact, even today, I park my car in an old auto body shop that's half a block away from the Cadillac. I think you have to look at alternate use of spaces that we do have that wouldn't cause displacement of residents. And for me, an auto body shop, a parking garage might be an ideal space to use for a cultural center. So I would look into something like that. But having open space is a very difficult thing in the Tenderloin. We have very little, and the little we do have, we need for open space. But I love the idea of the arts. I mean, so far as I'm concerned, the Tenderloin really is an art district. We have music, we have art, we have photography, we have all theater, tons of theater projects all over the place, ballet, you name it. We have every kind of art in the Tenderloin, and it wouldn't hurt to be recognized as a cultural spot.
We also have, and I just saw Alex post this, we have, I think maybe we now rival the Mission for the most murals. We have murals everywhere, and a lot of them were painted during the COVID pandemic. So again, if you haven't come to the Tenderloin for a while, you won't believe the murals, especially on the giant Central Towers building, which was the only modern building we have really in the core of the Tenderloin. And beautiful murals have been painted all over it.
That's an Eichler building, by the way.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
No one talks about Stanley Eichler's major San Francisco building is in the Tenderloin.
Yeah, no, that's an Eichler building.
If you're local, come to our mural tour of the neighborhood on October 23rd. Another question is, how has tenant rights activism evolved since the 1980s? And what are the important fights that are still happening today?
Randy, I'm going to leave it for you.
Well, you know, I do talk about that in my book on the Tenderloin, all the tenant fights. You can find it there. But I mean, we've been remarkably successful. The Tenderloin has the best living conditions it's had really forever right now. Our tenants are protected. The challenge is more the drug dealing and the crime on the streets where people don't feel safe. But the quality of housing has never been higher. We also have a far higher quality of property owner, because whereas when Kathy and I got first involved in the Tenderloin, We had a lot of absentee owners who never came down here, didn't care at all about the neighborhood. But over time, we've gotten owners who really love the history, want to be part of the neighborhood. There's far more owner involvement now than there's ever been. So there's a lot of real positive things to make better for tenants. But again, if tenants don't feel safe walking down their street, that's a problem. And it's been an ongoing problem, particularly since the pandemic began.
Mhm. I know the Cadillac makes a special effort to keep the sidewalks clean, but it takes a lot of effort. We go out there, we hose them down every day, we sweep them. I send out people to ask people to move if they set up tents. And it's basically for our tenants feeling safe, coming out of the building, popping out to the grocery store, going to a restaurant, trying to get something to eat, and coming back safe. It's a challenge.
You know, I should add that some people only know how to evaluate neighborhoods, whether or not they're gentrified. So I've heard people say, well, Jane Jacobs, look, West Village is gentrified, so she didn't preserve the neighborhood. But the Tenderloin is an example of a neighborhood that's not going to ever be gentrified. The only one in San Francisco. It's all a quarter, 40% almost of its housing stock is off the private market. But if you don't give people a quality living environment and safety on the streets, it's not a desirable neighborhood to live in. So that's what we have not succeeded in making the Tenderloin a desirable neighborhood for the tenants who are in affordable housing. And that's what we're still working on.
Oh, Randy, you touched on something pretty important that we didn't touch on, and that is rent control. That's like the other side of the flip coin of preserving a neighborhood and a community, is making it continuously affordable to the residents who live there. And Randy was very instrumental in getting rent control and identifying buildings as permanent housing as opposed to tourist housing. So I just want to acknowledge your fight on that area.
Yeah, we did. San Francisco has the strongest array of tenant protections and housing affordability protections of any city in the country. So that certainly has helped the Tenderloin, but to preserve itself.
Mhm.
So we have another question. Was the mitigation that we discussed earlier the beginning of community benefit assessments in the US?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if people would necessarily say that because we didn't call it a community benefit agreement. We called it mitigations. We got the William Penn, the Dalt, the Hamlin, and the Ritz hotels in the Tenderloin are all nonprofit owners and funded by that deal, most of them. But yeah, I don't know if the term community benefits was used then.
It wasn't.
But this is the thing, as I said in my article in Beyond Cron, that if this deal had happened in New York, it would have been a national precedent on the front page of the New York Times. But it happened in San Francisco, so it was barely covered locally. Just how it is.
Well, they were trying to keep it quiet so it wouldn't spread, Randy.
Yeah, except for the extortion. I mean, the fact that we were accused of extortion.
We were extortionists, right?
Yeah.
We deserve the name the Tenderloin.
Yeah.
Jane Jacobs famously said, old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings. How might the reuse of old buildings like SRO hotels continue to work in the Tenderloin? And can traditional historic preservation continue to support the creation of affordable housing?
Well, let me just mention, we have a lot of new buildings in the Tenderloin. They're built on parking lots and garages, not on existing historic buildings. So we have not frozen in time. I think the point about what Kathy made earlier is that when you walk through the Tenderloin and you see, we don't just have old buildings, we have buildings of great architectural distinction. And not every old building has architectural distinction, but we had great architects. The Tenderloin was a very expensive neighborhood when it was built. It was not a low-income neighborhood to be built. It was almost all built from 1907 to 1930 because it was demolished in the earthquake. I don't know how many people on this call have seen the Hibernia Bank at 1 Jones Street, the only building in the wide surrounding area to survive the earthquake from all the photos. I was in the Hibernia yesterday. It's one of the great buildings in the United States. It's a palace. So the Tenderloin was really built. And what's interesting is a lot of our SRO owners, who often are from the Indian community, have invested heavily in restoring historic preservation, from neon signs to just redoing their buildings. And our SROs are in a higher quality and more historic look today than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So what we've had is the history is really more vibrant and visible because of the investments owners have made, not
Yes,
just at the Cadillac, which got it started. But I have to tell everyone that when the Loopers got involved in the Cadillac Hotel, people thought they were absolutely crazy. Nobody was putting money into SRO historic preservation. Nobody. I think they were the first nonprofit restored hotel west of Chicago, right?
yeah. I want to interject for a minute and say that, oh, gee, and I forgot my point. No, just pass it. I forgot that fast. That's what happens when you get old.
Apologies, I think my internet's having a little trouble. Can you guys see and hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
a little bit. Oh, I remembered what I wanted to say. Randy was talking, the question was, how do you see old buildings? Do you see them lasting kind of, you know? I'm having trouble with my old building. I have old elevators, I have old bathrooms, I have old plumbing, I have old electricity. We have one plug in every room. And of course, you know, we have thousands of appliances now that go into this one plug. So we always have blowouts in our system. I don't see the SROs as we have them with shared bathrooms and one electrical plug per room, no kitchens, lasting too much. I do see the need for a total renovation of the interiors to bring them up to date, to bring them up to code, and to bring so that people can actually feel like they live, can live comfortably with the advances in technology that we have today. So I do see the need for funds for renovation, but also see that we need to try to figure out how to renovate and still preserve the same number of rooms. It would be nice if the Cadillac was able to renovate and have small little kitchenettes and have lots of electrical plumbing and new plumbing and things like that. I don't see the ability to pay for it at this point.
Well, you know, that's the private owners are doing just that. I mean, there's a hotel in the Tenderloin, the Garland. I mean, they have micro kitchens in every room. Bathrooms are being installed in hotels that don't have private baths, because it's correct. The current population, the population that originally inhabited the SRO hotels were heavily truck drivers and longshore seamen who were at sea. They were at sea or they were on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And they never had the levels of occupancy we have, especially when we master lease hotels for the unhoused. So there's a lot more people living in the hotels and the occupancy much higher. The 1 to 10 bathroom ratio doesn't work. So a number of owners have put private baths in every room, and they can do it without reducing the room count. And the wiring, obviously people use computers now. You need more than one plug. So we have upgraded wiring. It's hard for the nonprofits because they have to get some public funding, but throughout the Tenderloin, you've seen that kind of upgrading occur.
Right. But
I'd
if you
like
want to keep your rents low, like mine are very low, from no money contributed by some residents who have no income, like illegal immigrants, to very 30% of the income, which might come out to about $200-300 a month. So there's no way I can barely pay what I need to pay, let alone do renovations based on those funds. Whereas private hotel owners, they can charge more, and they do.
Mhm. Kathy, I'd like to jump in and ask you a question specifically. Why did you and Leroy decide to buy the Cadillac? Like, what was it about the Cadillac that was?
Well, you know, Leroy was black, and the name, the Cadillac Hotel, was awfully appealing to him. He always wanted a Cadillac, and he could never afford one. So
we
here
bought
was
a
a
hotel
building called the Cadillac. And then there was the person who owned it was a real estate investor. He was black, and his name was John Foggy, and we were renting a small building from him onto Visadero Street, where we did culinary training for kids
Oh.
in juvie.
Uh-huh.
And we said to him, we would love to buy a building. Do you have any buildings? And, you know, being Black, they had this kind of brotherhood thing going for him. And he said, I've got the greatest place in the world that I'm looking to get rid of. He was a real estate speculator. And he thought again that he was going to end up rich, which he didn't. And he sold it to us. He agreed to finance it for 5 years, pay the
Wow.
mortgage, the insurance, the taxes, everything. 5 years, he built that into the price. He agreed to take a second mortgage so that we could assume his first mortgage. And he just made it very convenient for us to do that. And it fit in with our goals of low-income housing, trying to figure out how we could own our own property and run our nonprofit like we do our own lives. We never rented. We always bought what we needed.
Right.
And it just seemed to make sense to not rent, but buy. And here was an opportunity. Plus, I didn't tell you, we went to Crocker Bank with Charles Foggy, with Mr. Foggy, to see Charles Crocker, who was the founder's son of Crocker Bank. And he owned the first mortgage on the Cadillac Hotel. It was a non-assumable mortgage of 7%. And this in 1976, interest rates were 15-16%. So Mr. Foggy and Leroy went to Crocker Bank, saw Mr. Crocker, and asked him if he would let us assume that loan. And he said, shh, I'll do it, but you can't tell anyone until after I'm dead. So everything clicked, you know?
Yeah.
But that's a typical San Francisco story. So many banks that we know today, like Bank of America, Crocker Bank, Hibernia Bank, were owned by local families. And you could have a relationship with people that you banked with, which you no longer can. So it was everything falling together at the right time and place, and it allowed us to purchase the Cadillac Hotel.
Let me also mention, if I could, that in the 1970s, when they bought the Cadillac, if you wanted to buy an SRO in San Francisco, people were desperate to sell. SROs were considered failing. And one of the whole themes of this whole event we're doing right now, we missed an important point that now we can hit, which is that historic preservation did not, in most cities, New York City, Seattle, most of LA, some of LA, they just destroyed SROs as part of urban renewal. SROs located near the downtown area, and San Francisco became the first city in the nation to pass a law, originally a moratorium in 1979, then a law in 1981, to prevent the conversion or demolition of SROs. And that became a critical for the Tenderloin, because we had so many. If you could have demolished or converted the SROs in the Tenderloin in the 80s, we would be having this show, because it wouldn't have been, the neighborhood wouldn't have been preserved. But we had a separate city law to protect that. So there wasn't a big demand for hotels. So Leroy and Kathy went in with no money, and the guy was happy to give it to him.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, we literally had no money.
That's incredible. And it's a fascinating story. It really is. I mean, the Cadillac, if you go to the website too, there's so much more on the history of you and Leroy and how it
They had a boxing ring where Muhammad Ali and Miles Davis and all the great boxers, Sugar Ray Robinson, boxed in the Cadillac.
Amazing.
David Crosby lived in the Cadillac on the 3rd floor. I haven't figured out what room, but he was there. Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead lived in the Cadillac. It's all in my book. I mean, the Tenderloin has a remarkable history, but it's really the Cadillac's history is stupendous.
Right, it is true. It's Randy, I have a question specifically for you as well. I was wondering about this idea of, you know, taking what you've learned from your work in the Tenderloin and like talking about the Cadillac and that role. What do you think the future holds for affordable housing, and what can we learn from your experiences that we could put into practice today in, you know, different cities around the country?
Well, I think if it hadn't been the pandemic, and we were having this exact event right now, I'd be talking to you about how amazing the Tenderloin is doing. It's never done better. Everything that we set in motion has been successful. And unfortunately, the strategy that we had for the Tenderloin was have laws, have nonprofits acquire as much housing as they can to permanently preserve the affordability. We have the rent control, we lease hotels from the city, and that's permanently affordable.
Mhm.
And then to generate the income necessary for small businesses in the neighborhood to get by, you need market rate tenants. So we had all
Right.
this housing that actually came online,
Mhm.
major projects in the neighborhood that either came online during COVID or soon will be built. But of course, those
Right.
projects, which used to be 100% occupied as soon as they opened,
Right.
are like 30% occupied.
Yeah.
And so, and businesses that were about to open up aren't opening because of COVID issues. So
That's so
we've
hard.
been particularly hurt because we had so much coming online. But I think what the lesson of the Tenderloin is that, and I always preach this,
Mhm.
you can't just say, okay, we're going to stop anything new from coming in because that's gentrification. You have to recognize that communities can't succeed without people who have earning power. The
Right.
tenants my organization houses have very little disposable income.
Right.
If you say we want cafes, we want restaurants, we want shops, well, there has to be a customer base. The West Village always had that. And the West Village's problem was when you had these national chains come in and jack up the rents astronomically on their commercial spaces, which are now closed since COVID. But we never really had a retail operation. The Tenderloin never, it was always, and we have a thing on all the businesses on the matchbook.com. You can go on the Tenderloin Museum website for that. The Tenderloin was always 99% bars and restaurants. That's always been and gambling before it was stopped. Gambling was great for us, but that was stopped in the late 50s. But the restaurants and bars, so we always support new restaurants and bars because that's really the economic power of the neighborhood. So that plus people to patronize the bars. And so we were really on the right track until COVID really set us off.
Right. We have some really good questions here in the Q&A box that I should call to your attention. This is one from Barbara. Is there any activity with the Community Land Trust to permanently preserve affordable housing in the Tenderloin right now?
Well, they're buying their second building right now, but we have a bunch, Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, Mercy Housing. We have a number of nonprofits. That's why so much of the Tenderloin has been preserved, because we've had nonprofits acquire so much housing. So no neighborhood compares, probably in the United States, to the percentage of nonprofit owned housing that we have as an overall percentage of the housing stock in the Tenderloin. And so that's a great way to go. Of course, we haven't had enough money in federal money, but it's worked for the Tenderloin. Plus the 4 hotels we got from the mitigation, it's 4 hotels.
Wow, yeah. Barbara had a second part to that, and she's asking, is there any thought of turning some of the old SROs that became tourist hotels back into SROs? Now
That's
that
happening. That's exactly happening. It's happening. Yes, definitely. It's happening regularly, and the Governor Newsom's home key plan is designed to do that. I was involved with a hotel on Geary Street. There was the Diva Hotel, where it used to be the Summerton. It should never have been converted. The city then just bought it. So a lot of positive things are happening around the hotel, because tourist hotels. We also in San Francisco had a huge student housing industry. Students would then, all these hotels rent to students, which is not tourists. They're legally.
That's right.
But they were only here for a year and they leave and the like. That industry is temporarily dead. So we have student housing places selling to the city. So
Right, interesting.
yes, that is
Same as the supportive housing. Barbara wanted to make that supportive housing. Right. Here's another question from an anonymous attendee. What about the new expensive bars and restaurants moving in that seem unfriendly to the current residents? Are they contributing or not? If not, in what ways? So is there any sort of a negative, I guess, sort of between sort of higher end bars and
you feel free to chime in, Kathy. I don't mean to. You want to see?
Right across the street, we have a place called the Black Cat. And it's, I guess you could say it's an upper class bar and social place. It contributes to the neighborhood. The thing of it is that the Tenderloin needs to be more balanced. We can't survive with just poor people. We need a survive with the middle class. We need to survive with people who have money, who come in and spend it.
Mhm.
And the Black Cat does contribute to the community. I know people in the Cadillac who go to the Black Cat. They'll buy a drink and sit down and enjoy the music, and spend the whole evening nursing this one drink that they
Right.
paid $15 for. Might be more expensive, but 2 drinks at a dive will cost you that, you know?
Right,
So
right,
why
right.
not enjoy music and feel free to go in and enjoy a different kind of scene?
Mhm.
And I like that. I like a mixed neighborhood. I don't like it all poor, all rich. I like a neighborhood where people from all kinds of life can feel free to come in and bring their money and spend it in the Tenderloin. So I do feel that these high class bars serve a purpose, and they do serve some of our community.
Mhm.
Other people might not feel comfortable being there, but there are people who do.
Right, right,
It's
right.
also interesting, if I could mention, that above the Black Cat is a permanent supportive housing women's hotel. The whole
Right,
block, the Black Cat on, is supportive housing. So
right,
I
right.
think there's some people, they see any business that a middle-class person can afford is somehow causing gentrification, and it's a very
Mm.
misguided
Right,
perception of
right,
how
right,
cities operate. Under that theory, we should close down Valencia Street and the Mission because they have expensive restaurants.
right, right. Well, it's
Well,
mixed.
it's mixed, and I think that's the important thing is you have to have a mixture. Right now, if anything, San Francisco is missing its middle class. When studio apartments rent for 1,800 a month, um, how many middle class people can afford it, or even couples or families can afford that kind of rent? We are missing a lot of the middle class, and whatever we can do to help bring them back or encourage them to stay, I think is something we should look at and encourage.
Mhm. This is interesting. Um, KCR is asking, I guess when the central YMCA operated there, that you had more of a crossroads of all different kinds of backgrounds.
Yeah.
Is that the case? And what do you think you can do to recreate that effect? What are the efforts being made towards?
Yeah, we did have
Re-
a very mixed group of people who
Mhm.
would come into the Tenderloin, go to the gym, work out,
Mhm.
then go get lunch or breakfast or get a cup
Right,
of
right, right.
coffee down the street. Unfortunately, it's been converted to housing for homeless who,
Mm.
long-term housing, but nonetheless housing for homeless people, and the gym is closed down. They tried thinking of ways to reopen the gym and the Tenderloin, but it's not possible for them.
Let me
No.
mention that the historic preservation, the Y, the central Y is an historic building that President Taft inaugurated. There's a great photo of President Taft at the
Wow.
at the groundbreaking of the central YMCA. But there was a huge cost to deal with some retrofit issues at the Y,
Mm.
which led them to want to sell the building because they couldn't afford to fix it. And then it
Wow.
became, the city bought it for affordable housing. So,
Right.
you know, that's what happened there. But we've
There are
always,
realities to that. Sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. But, you know, Bodecker Park has been great, which used to be the downtown bowl,
Mhm.
bowling alley, a great scene, but that became now our park. That's our recreational facilities right now.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's not going to bring people into the neighborhood.
No.
No,
Well,
not like why.
not like the Y did, and I see we only have a few minutes left. Let's think about the future. What is the future of the Tenderloin? From each of you, Kathy and Randy, what do you see, and what are your hopes and aspirations for? And you could just dream. Where do you think it's going, and what are your wishes for it to become? Kathy, you first.
Okay, well, my hope is that we don't have an earthquake and things kind of stay the same. If there's an earthquake, most of these buildings are brick. A lot of
Oh,
them have been retrofitted, but there's going to be damage.
Yeah.
My hope is that if there is an earthquake and there's buildings that are damaged, that we're able to keep the housing affordable for the people we serve.
Mhm.
What do I see for the future? I see lots of the Tenderloin being the same. A new immigrant community moving in and
Yep.
living in our units and our housing and moving on, and another one coming in and doing the same thing. I don't see the Tenderloin changing too much. I would like to see the streets become more habitable. I'd
Mhm.
like to see them become safer, but I don't see too much different in terms of housing.
That's right. That's great.
And I would say that
Mm.
everything that we set in motion to improve the quality of life in the Tenderloin and for the existing residents would have been already in place if not for the pandemic. And now the challenge is to the influx of drug dealing sites the city's been unable to resolve has changed our progress. But the structures, the restaurants, the housing, it's all there.
Right.
It's just not occupied. So
Right.
once that happens, we're still on the right track. And again, I would like to encourage people who want to learn more about the Tenderloin to pick up my book on the Tenderloin, because I really have 118 pictures and it really plays out the whole flavor of what we haven't even discussed in this event, which is
Right.
we were one of the great neighborhoods in the United States from 1907 into the 1950s. We've been on a decline, but we were the most expensive and affluent and successful neighborhood. A lot of it was due to illegal gambling, but nevertheless, we were successful. And bars and restaurants are going to get the Tenderloin back to where it was pre-pandemic, I think. So I still remain optimistic.
Well, I can see why our Alex reached out to us and regarding the synergy of the work of Jane Jacobs. And we have quite a bit in common. And you are just a wonderful example of, I think, everything that she would really admire very much. And our board is grateful to have had this opportunity to meet you. And I hope this is just the beginning of our relationship with the Tenderloin. I want to check back in, and Chelsea and I, the associate director, were fascinated by you, and we want to come visit, and we want to,
Oh, got to get you to come visit.
we have to come. And I recommend everyone on this call, please go see it and understand it and study it. And just we commend you and applaud all of the efforts and the vision, Kathy, the vision that you and Leroy had so long ago to set all of this in motion is just really inspirational. It's nothing short of that. And I'm just so grateful to have had the opportunity to meet you, all of you, Katie, Alex, Randy. You're in there somewhere, Alex, you're behind the scenes, but so I don't know if Katie, do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap this up now as the director of the Tenderloin Museum?
Oh, just reading some of these comments. Thanks so much for the conversation. Excellent conversation. Next time I'm in San Francisco, I'll be sure to visit the museum. So that's all really lovely to see. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. And we hope to see you in the Tenderloin soon.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you all so very much. We will stay in touch.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.